The morning sun broke golden over the hills of Evergreen 7, painting the farmlands in warm amber light that made everything look like it belonged in a painting nobody had bothered to frame yet. Lena Vidar knelt in the dirt of her greenhouse with soil under her fingernails and a smile on her face that most people in the galaxy would never believe belonged to her, and she liked it that way. "Mama, this one is growing crooked," said Mira, her 7-year-old daughter, pointing at a tomato vine that had twisted itself sideways like it had somewhere better to be. "Then we help it stand straight," Lena said, and she guided the vine gently against the wooden stake, tying it with a soft strip of cloth, the way she tied everything now, with patience, with care, with hands that had long ago decided they were done breaking things. Mira watched with those wide dark eyes that missed nothing, and Lena sometimes caught her breath when she looked at them, because they were exactly what she feared and hoped for all at once. Like her father's eyes, the man who had died in the border wars before Mira ever got to meet him. But that was another life, and Lena had buried it so deep she sometimes forgot it was there at all. Evergreen 7 was a small colony on the edge of compact space, home to about 40,000 people who had come here for the same reason Lena had: to live quietly, and to raise their children far away from the noise of a galaxy that never seemed to stop fighting. There were farmers, and teachers, and scientists, and engineers, and there was Governor Ashan, a kind and round-faced man who believed deeply that if you were polite enough to the universe would be polite back. Lena liked him, even though she knew he was wrong. The colony had no military, no weapons grid, no orbital defense platforms, and that was by design, because Evergreen 7 existed under the terms of the Velen Accord, a peace treaty between humanity and the Zarathi Dominion that said certain border worlds would remain demilitarized as a gesture of mutual trust. The Zarathi were a reptilian species that had conquered 11 worlds across 3 star systems, and they looked at humans the way a wolf looks at sheep that have learned to build fences, curious but not impressed. Lena had fought the Zarathi once, a long time ago, in a war that the official record said never happened, and she knew things about them that would make Governor Ashan lose his appetite for a month. But she did not talk about that, because the woman who knew those things was not the woman who grew tomatoes and braided her daughter's hair every morning before school. That woman was dead, and Lena intended to keep her that way. The days on Evergreen 7 moved slowly and sweetly, like honey dripping from a spoon, and Lena filled them with small, beautiful things. The sound of Mira laughing as she chased butterflies through the garden, the smell of bread baking in the kitchen of old Mrs. Tanaka next door, the way the twin moons rose over the valley at dusk and turned the river into a ribbon of silver. She had earned this peace with blood and silence, and she held onto it the way a drowning woman holds onto air. One afternoon, Mira came running home from school with a drawing she had made, a picture of their greenhouse, with the 2 of them standing outside holding hands, and above them she had drawn a big yellow sun with a smiley face. "That is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," Lena said, and she meant it more than Mira would ever understand. She pinned it to the kitchen wall, next to 7 other drawings, and a photograph of Mira as a baby, and she stood there looking at it for a long time after Mira had gone to play outside. That was the life, and it was good, and it was enough. Then the Zarathi came. It started with whispers and rumors that spread through the colony like cold air under a door. Zarathi warships had been spotted near the edge of the system, more than the usual patrol, and the diplomatic channels that connected Evergreen 7 to the nearest human outpost had gone quiet, in a way that made the silence feel heavy. Governor Ashan called a town meeting and stood at the podium with his best reassuring smile, and told everyone that there was nothing to worry about, and that the Zarathi were simply conducting routine exercises, and that he had sent a formal inquiry through proper channels. Lena sat in the back row with Mira on her lap, and said nothing, but her eyes were different that night. Harder, sharper, and if anyone had known what to look for, they would have seen the ghost of someone else looking out through them. 3 days later, a Zarathi diplomatic shuttle descended through the clouds and landed in the colony square, and the colonists gathered to watch with the nervous curiosity of people who wanted to believe the best but could feel the worst sitting heavy in their stomachs. Shuttle doors opened, and out walked Sub-Commander Ryvek, a lean and sharp-faced Zarathi officer with scales the color of wet slate and eyes like 2 drops of molten copper. He looked at the gathered humans the way someone looks at furniture in a room they are about to renovate. Behind him came 6 Zarathi soldiers in full combat armor, which was unusual for a diplomatic visit, and Governor Ashan noticed, but chose not to mention it, because mentioning it would mean acknowledging that something was wrong, and he was not ready to do that yet. Ryvek toured the colony with a thin smile that never reached his eyes, and he asked polite questions about crop yields and population numbers and school enrollment, and he recorded everything on a datapad that hummed softly in his clawed hand. When he reached Lena's greenhouse, he paused and looked at her, and she looked back at him with the calm, steady gaze of a woman pulling weeds. "You are a farmer," he said, and it was not a question. "Parem," she said. He glanced at his datapad, where her file showed a name and an age and a daughter, and then a wall of black redaction bars where her history should have been. "Interesting file," he said. "Boring life," she said. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, and moved on. Later that night aboard the shuttle, one of Ryvek's officers flagged the redacted file and suggested they investigate further, and Ryvek looked at it for a moment and then dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Just another breeder," he said, and he turned back to his mission briefing, where the real plans were laid out in sharp red lines across a map of the colony. Plans that had nothing to do with diplomacy. And in her farmhouse on the hill, Lena tucked Mira into bed and kissed her forehead and whispered good night, and then she stood at the window looking out at the stars, where somewhere in the dark the warships waited, and her breathing was even and her face showed nothing at all. But something old and quiet stirred behind her eyes, like a wolf lifting its head at the scent of smoke on the wind. The sky split open at dawn, not with thunder and not with lightning, but with the white-hot scream of orbital bombardment that turned the colony's communication tower into a pillar of fire and glass, and the sound that followed was not an explosion, but a silence. The sudden, awful silence of 40,000 people realizing at the same moment that no one was coming to help them. General Vorath Kane watched the bombardment from the bridge of his flagship. The Dominion's Fang, with his arms folded behind his back, and his face showing nothing more than mild professional interest. He was enormous even by Zarathi standards, nearly 9 feet of scaled muscle and bone, wrapped in ceremonial battle armor that had been forged from the metal of a dead world he had personally conquered, and his eyes were the deep red of cooling embers. "The communication array is destroyed," reported his tactical officer. "Good," Vorath said in a voice like 2 stones grinding together. "Send the drop ships and begin the cleansing." He did not call it an invasion, because invasion implied resistance, and he did not expect any. Beside him stood War Priestess Sefka, a tall and gaunt female Zarathi, draped in robes stitched with the teeth of fallen enemies. And she watched the colony burn on the view screen, with something close to religious joy. "The blood rite must be observed," she said. "Strike the young first, and the spirit of the species will crack like dry bone." Vorath did not believe in blood rites or spirits or any of the old superstitions, but he understood their tactical value. Killing children broke the morale of a population faster than any weapon, and morale was just another system to be dismantled. "Do as you wish with the cubs," he said, and he turned back to his star charts, because this colony was not the mission. It was merely a test, a finger pressed against the soft belly of humanity to see how hard they flinched before the end. Real war began. On the ground, the colony of Evergreen 7 died in pieces. Dropships roared down through the smoke-filled sky, and disgorged columns of Zarathi soldiers into streets where children had been walking to school just minutes before. And the soldiers moved through the colony with the mechanical efficiency of predators who had done this many times on many worlds. There was no battle, because there was nothing to fight with. Farmers threw themselves in front of their families and were cut down. Teachers barricaded classroom doors with desks and chairs that splintered like paper under plasma fire. And old Mrs. Tanaka, who baked bread every morning, stood in her doorway with a kitchen knife and told the soldiers they were not welcome in her home. And they killed her where she stood. Governor Ashen ran to the landing square with his hands raised and his voice shaking, and he called out that he wished to negotiate, that there must be a misunderstanding. Velen Accord guaranteed their safety. A Zarathi officer broadcast his face across every surviving screen in the colony, and then shot him through the chest, and his body fell in the same square where he had once given speeches about peace and cooperation. Mira was in the greenhouse. Lena had told her to hide there if anything ever went wrong, behind the big water tank in the back corner where the tomato vines grew thick enough to make a curtain. And Mira had done exactly what her mother said, because she always did. She sat in the dark, with her knees pulled up to her chest, and she could hear the screaming outside, and the sound of boots on gravel, and the sharp electric crack of weapons she did not have names for. She was scared, but she did not cry, because her mother had once told her that being brave did not mean you were not afraid. It meant you kept breathing when everything in you wanted to stop. The greenhouse door shattered inward, and two Zarathi soldiers stepped through. Their armor splashed with dust and something darker, and they swept the room with their weapons until one of them spotted the small shape huddled behind the water tank. They dragged her out into the light, and she looked up at them with her dark, steady eyes, her mother's eyes, and she did not scream. The soldier holding her arm reported to Subcommander Ryvek, who reported to General Vorath, who gave the order from orbit, without looking up from his charts. "Make an example of the cubs," he said. "Break their spirit before it forms." They killed Mira in the town square, along with 14 other children, and they arranged the small bodies in the pattern of the Zarathi dominance ritual, a circle with the arms pointing outward like the rays of a terrible sun. Because this was how the Dominion marked its conquests, by showing that even the youngest and most innocent of an enemy belonged to them now. The soldiers stood guard around them, display with their weapons ready, as if they expected the dead children to rise, and the surviving colonists were herded into the streets to see and to understand what they were now. Property. Lena was on the far ridge when the attack began, 3 miles out, returning from a supply run to the northern caves, where she stored emergency provisions that she had never told anyone about. She saw the fire first, a column of black smoke rising from where the comm tower had been, and then she heard the bombardment rolling across the valley like the drumbeat of something enormous and hungry. She ran, not the way a civilian runs, panicked and stumbling, but the way something else runs, fast and fluid and low to the ground, with her eyes scanning every ridge and every shadow. And her body moved with a memory that her mind had tried to forget, but her muscles never did. She reached the colony in 20 minutes, and what she found was a graveyard with a pulse. Streets were scorched and broken and filled with smoke and the sounds of weeping. And Zarathi patrols moved through the ruins like sharks through shallow water. And Lena slipped between them like she was made of shadow, because she had been trained to move through worse than this, in places that did not officially exist. She reached the town square, and she saw the circle. She saw the small bodies arranged like a ritual offering to a god that deserved to starve. She saw Mira. Her daughter lay on the cold stone, with her dark hair spread around her head, and her small hands open at her sides, and her eyes were closed, as if she were sleeping and waiting for her mother to wake her up. Lena walked to her and knelt beside her, and the Zarathi guards did not see her, because she moved the way smoke moves, without sound and without permission. She gathered Mira into her arms, and held her against her chest, and the girl weighed almost nothing, had always weighed almost nothing, had always been this small and warm and precious and impossible thing that had made Lena believe the universe was worth staying in. She did not scream. She did not cry. She held her daughter and she breathed in the smell of her hair one last time, and somewhere deep inside her chest, a door that had been locked for 8 years blew open. And what came through it was not grief. It was something older than grief and colder than rage, and it had no name in any language spoken by any species in the known galaxy. She closed Mira's eyes with fingers that were steady as stone. "Mama is going to fix this baby," she whispered, and her voice was soft and gentle and absolutely terrifying. She laid Mira down and she stood, and she looked out across the burning colony with eyes that were no longer the eyes of a farmer or a mother or a woman who grew tomatoes in a greenhouse on the edge of nowhere. The woman who had walked into that square was a mother. The woman who walked out was something the galaxy had forgotten to fear. And the Zarathi had no idea what they had just woken up. The farmhouse on the hill was dark and silent when Lena walked through the door, and she moved through the rooms without turning on a light, because she did not need one, and because the dark felt like an old friend she had not spoken to in years. She passed the kitchen wall where Mira's drawing still hung, the greenhouse, the yellow sun with the smiley face, the 2 stick figures holding hands. And she did not look at them, because if she looked at them, she would stop. And if she stopped, she would break. And she could not afford to break. Not now, not yet, not until every single one of them had paid. She went to the greenhouse and knelt on the floor and pressed her hand against the 3rd tile from the left wall. And a section of the floor hissed open to reveal a sealed vault that had not been touched in 8 years. Inside was everything she had promised herself she would never touch again. The combat suit came first, matte black adaptive armor that shifted, rippled like living shadow when she pulled it from its case, and it molded to her body the moment she put it on, as if it had been waiting for her, as if it remembered her shape the way she remembered its weight. Then the weapons, a collapsed plasma railgun that extended to full length with a whisper of magnetic locks, breaching charges small enough to fit in her palm and powerful enough to crack a starship hull, monofilament wire thinner than a human hair and sharp enough to cut through Zarathi battle armor like it was wet paper. And then the Neuralink headset, and when she placed it against her temple, the world went quiet for a single heartbeat before a voice spoke inside her mind. "Captain Vidar," said Fenris, her combat AI, in a tone that was calm and precise and utterly without emotion. "It has been 2,847 days since last activation. What is the mission?" Lena looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the vault lid, and the face that looked back was someone she recognized but had hoped never to see again. "Total war," she said. Fenris did not ask why, because Fenris did not need to. The AI had already accessed the colony's destroyed network, pulled the surveillance footage, reconstructed the timeline of the massacre, and cataloged every Zarathi unit on the ground and in orbit before Lena had finished speaking. "I count 12,000 Zarathi ground forces," Fenris reported, "supported by 4 cruisers and a flagship in low orbit. The flagship is registered as the Dominion's Fang, commanded by General Vorath Kane of the 4th Annihilation Fleet." "Tell me about him," Lena said as she loaded the railgun with steady hands. "Vorath Kane, age approximately 300 standard years, career spanning 11 planetary conquests, psychological profile indicates extreme confidence bordering on arrogance, with a particular blind spot regarding species he considers inferior. He does not believe a human is capable of threatening him. Good, Lena said, and she slung the railgun across her back and stepped out into the night. The first patrol died before they knew she was there. 8 Zarathi soldiers, walking a perimeter route along the eastern ridge, their armor sealed and their weapons hot, and their helmet sensors scanning the dark for threats that their training told them could not exist on a demilitarized colony world. Lena came out of the shadows like something that had been born there. She killed the first 2 with the monofilament wire, a single motion that separated heads from shoulders so cleanly that the bodies stood upright for a full second before they fell. And by the time they hit the ground, she had already driven a combat blade through the throat of the 3rd and into the chest of the 4th. The remaining 4 turned and fired, but she was not where they aimed because she had already moved. Between them, like water through broken stone, and the last thing each of them saw was a pair of human eyes, calm and dark and completely without mercy. When she was done, she arranged their bodies in a circle with their arms pointing outward. The Zarathi dominance ritual turned back on them. The next morning, Sub-Commander Ryvek stood over the bodies, with his copper eyes wide and his scales pale, and he said nothing for a long time, because there was nothing in his training that had prepared him for this. Local wildlife, suggested one of his officers, though his voice did not sound convinced. Wildlife does not arrange bodies in ritual patterns, Ryvek said quietly. He reported the incident to General Vorath, who received the news with the mild irritation of someone informed that an insect had entered the room. Find it and kill it, Vorath said, and he returned to his planning. The second night was worse. Occupied colony, like a ghost made of knives and bad intentions. And by the time the sun rose, she had destroyed the main supply depot, rigged 3 dropships with breaching charges that would detonate the moment their engines ignited, and disabled the ground-to-orbit targeting relay that connected the Zarathi soldiers to their fleet support. And she left a message, carved into the hull of Vorath's personal command shuttle in the Zarathi script, deep and precise as if written by a machine, was a single word: Mother. Ryvek stared at the word for a very long time, and then he went to his quarters and pulled Lena's colony registration file and stared at the wall of black redaction bars and felt something cold crawl up his spine. He sent the file to Zarathi Central Intelligence with a priority flag, and the response came back in less than an hour, which was unprecedented because intelligence requests normally took days, and the speed of the response scared him more than anything else. The file read, Classification Level Absolute, Aegis Corps Operative, Designation Fenris Handler, Threat Assessment, Extinction Level, Do not engage without fleet support. Repeat, do not engage alone. Ryvek ran to Vorath's command post and placed the file in front of him and said, General, we need to leave this world immediately. Vorath read the file and then looked at Ryvek with those deep red eyes, and the contempt in them was so heavy it was almost physical. You want me to retreat from one human female, he said, and it was not a question. She is not just a female, sir. She is Aegis Corps. They are the reason the border wars ended. They are the reason. I know what Aegis Corps is, Vorath said, and I know what humans are. They are soft, and they are slow, and they are afraid of their own shadows. Send 50 soldiers to find her and bring me her head. He sent 50 soldiers into the dark. None of them came. Recovery teams found their helmet cameras scattered across 3 different buildings. And when the footage was reviewed in Vorath's command post, the room went very quiet. The footage showed the soldiers entering a building in tactical formation, professional and confident, and then the lights went out, and there was movement in the darkness, fast and fluid and wrong, in a way that made the Zarathi officers watching feel something they had no word for. There was screaming and gunfire, and the wet sound of things being cut. And then one by one, the camera feeds went black, until only one remained, lying on the floor at an angle. And in the last frame before it died, the camera captured a single image, a pair of human eyes reflecting in the dark, calm and steady, and burning with something that was not rage and not madness, but something far worse: purpose. Ryvek looked at Vorath, and Vorath looked at the frozen image on the screen, and the room was silent, except for the hum of machines and the sound of an empire beginning to understand that it had made a terrible mistake. But Vorath was a general who had conquered 11 worlds, and he did not know how to be afraid, so he mistook the feeling in his chest for anger, and he clenched his fists and said, "Double the patrols and activate the perimeter drones. She is one woman, and she will be found." Outside in the darkness, Lena heard the drones spin up, and she smiled, and it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had just been given more weapons to steal. By the fourth night, the Zarathi soldiers had stopped calling her a human. They called her the Revenant. The name spread through the ranks like a virus, whispered in the dark corners of occupied buildings, and muttered over cold rations by soldiers who no longer slept because sleep meant darkness, and darkness meant her. Lena did not know they had given her a name, and she would not have cared if she did, because names were for people, and she was not a person right now. She was a consequence. On the third night, she had found the surviving colonists. They were being held in the colony's old community center. 312 men and women and 26 children, the ones who had survived, guarded by a rotating detail of 40 Zarathi soldiers who treated them like livestock, awaiting processing. Lena did not free them, not yet, because freeing them meant moving them, and moving them meant noise, and noise meant attention, and she needed the Zarathi, looking everywhere except where she was about to go. Instead, she went to the old mining tunnels beneath the colony's northern ridge. Tunnels she had mapped in her first year on Evergreen 7, because old habits did not die, and a woman who had spent 15 years in Aegis Corps did not move to a new world without knowing every way out of it. She spent 4 hours rigging the tunnel network with lighting and supply caches and emergency medkits, and when she was done, there was a safe passage that ran from the community center's basement all the way to a hidden exit point 6 miles north in the foothills. Then she went back to work. "Fenris," she said, "I need their communications network." "Already inside," Fenris replied. "Their encryption is military grade, but it was designed to keep out other Zarathi, not Aegis-level intrusion protocols. I have full access to command frequencies, unit assignments, and supply logistics." "Start feeding false orders," Lena said. "Nothing obvious. Small things. Wrong coordinates. Shifted patrol times. Supply drops sent to empty locations. Make them confused before we make them scared." "Understood," said Fenris, and if an artificial intelligence could smile, this would have been the moment. The confusion began slowly, and then all at once. Patrols that should have overlapped missed each other by minutes, leaving gaps in the perimeter that Lena moved through like wind through an open window. And supply drops landed in the wrong grid squares, so soldiers went hungry, while crates of ammunition sat uncollected in empty fields. 2 units received conflicting orders, and nearly fired on each other in the dark. And the only reason they did not was because a sergeant recognized the voice of his commander shouting at him from across the street. Ryvek reported the communication failures to Vorath, who dismissed them as technical errors caused by the planet's atmospheric interference. Wanted to argue, but he had learned that arguing with Vorath was like arguing with a mountain. The mountain did not care, and you ended up feeling very small. On the 5th night, Lena killed War Priestess Sefka. She found her in the colony's old temple, a small wooden building that the Zarathi had repurposed as a blood shrine, where Sefka performed her rituals over trophies taken from the dead. And among the trophies were things that had belonged to children, small shoes and hair ribbons, and a drawing of a greenhouse with a yellow sun. Lena saw the drawing and something inside her went very still and very cold. Sethka was alone, kneeling before her altar with her arms raised, and her voice chanting words in the old Zarathi tongue. And she did not hear the door open, and she did not hear the footsteps, and she did not hear anything at all until the monofilament wire closed around her throat, and by then there was nothing left to hear. Altar, and placed a single sunflower on her chest. Mira's favorite flower, the one she had drawn 100 times in 100 pictures, the one that grew in the garden where they used to sit together and talk about everything and nothing. It was not a gesture of mercy, it was a signature. When the soldiers found Sethka in the morning, the reaction was not anger, but something closer to religious terror, because the war priestess was supposed to be protected by the old gods, and the old gods had apparently decided to look the other way. Desertions began that same day. 3 soldiers from the outer perimeter simply walked into the wilderness and never came back, and 2 more were found in their bunks, refusing to move, their eyes wide and their scales dull with the Zarathi equivalent of shock. Vorath executed the deserters' squad leader to restore discipline, but discipline was a rope, and Lena was cutting it 1 strand at a time. On the 6th night, she made her boldest move. Fenris had identified a vulnerability in the flagship's sensor array, a maintenance hatch that could be reached by a dropship approaching on a specific vector that the automated defense grid could not cover because of a known calibration error that the Zarathi had never bothered to fix, because no one had ever been insane enough to try. The probability of survival for this approach is 11%, Fenris noted. I am not going, Lena said. The ship is. She hijacked an empty Zarathi dropship using command codes that Fenris had pulled from the communications network. Programmed it to fly the precise vector at maximum speed, and sent it screaming into the flagship's sensor dome like a fist through a window. The explosion tore the sensor array apart and blinded the Dominion's Fang, and suddenly the most powerful warship in the fleet could not see what was happening on the ground below. Vorath stood on his bridge and watched the damage. Reports scroll across his screens, and for the first time his expression was not one of confidence or contempt, but something raw and harder, and closer to the bone. He made a decision. I am going to the surface, he said, and his officers looked at him with surprise, because generals did not go to the surface, not for this, not for one human. She wants a predator, Vorath said, his red eyes burning. I will show her what a predator looks like. He descended to Evergreen 7 with his personal guard, 200 elite warriors called the Iron Teeth, the finest soldiers the Dominion had ever produced, each one hand-selected by Vorath himself, each one a veteran of multiple planetary conquests. He set his trap in the town square, the same square where the children had been displayed, and he placed the surviving colonists in the center, under armed guard, and he broadcast a message on every frequency. Come and collect your herd, human, he said. Waiting, Lena heard the message from the ridge, and she looked down at the square, and she saw the colonists kneeling in the dirt, and she saw the ring of elite soldiers, and she saw the trap for exactly what it was. He wants me to come in, she said. It would be inadvisable, Fenris said. I know. The probability of survival is... I do not care about probability, Fenris. She checked her weapons, and tightened the straps of her armor, and then she walked down the hill toward the lights of the town square, and she did not hurry, and she did not hide, and she walked the way a storm walks toward the shore, steady and inevitable, and full of things that had not happened yet. The Zarathi soldiers saw her first, a single figure emerging from the darkness into the floodlights, a human woman in black armor, with no weapon drawn and no expression on her face, and something about the way she moved made 200 elite warriors tighten their grips on their guns. Vorath stepped forward, and he was massive and terrible and ancient, and everything about him said that he was the apex predator of a galaxy that had learned to fear his name. Lena stopped at the edge of the light, and she looked up at him, and she smiled. Not the smile of a woman who was afraid, not the smile of a woman who had a plan. The smile of a woman who had already won, and was simply waiting for everyone else to realize it. Vorath looked into her eyes, and somewhere in the deep reptilian core of his brain, in the place where instinct lived before thought, something fired that had not fired in 300 years of warfare. His war scribe would later search the human archives to find a word for what the general felt in that moment. The word was fear. Vorath raised his fist, and the trap closed. 200 iron-teethed soldiers moved in perfect formation, sealing every exit and every shadow and every breath of open air around the town square, until Lena stood at the center of a ring of scaled death that should have been the last thing any living creature ever saw. Vorath stepped forward, his plasma glaive humming to life in his hand, the blade casting a sickly green light across his face that made his red eyes glow like something pulled from a furnace. "You are smaller than I expected," he said. Lena did not respond, because she was not listening to him. She was listening to Fenris, who was counting down in her ear. "All systems linked," Fenris reported. 17 breaching charges across 6 positions. 4 hijacked auto turrets online. Orbital comm relay spoofed and standing by. Colony defense grid repurposed. All assets awaiting your command, Captain. Colonist evacuation is 72% complete. The remaining civilians will reach the northern exit in approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes. She needed to give them 4 minutes. "You came here to die," Vorath said, and he sounded almost disappointed, as if he had hoped for more, as if the stories his soldiers had whispered about the Revenant had made him expect something greater than this small, quiet woman standing in the dirt. Lena looked at him, and the smile had not left her face. "I came here to say hello," she said. She closed her fist. The world came apart. 17 breaching charges detonated in a rolling chain that turned the Zarathi perimeter into a wall of fire and shrapnel, and the blast wave hit the outer ring of soldiers like a hammer hitting glass, and sent bodies flying through smoke and light. The 4 hijacked auto turrets swiveled on their mounts and opened fire into the formation from positions the iron teeth had thought were secure, and the crossfire turned the disciplined formation into a chaos of screaming and burning and scrambling for cover. High above in orbit, the Dominion's Fang, still blind from the destroyed sensor array, received a burst of spoofed command orders through the hacked comm relay. Orders that carried Vorath's own authentication codes pulled from the network by Fenris, and the flagship's weapons systems fired a single precision volley directly into the Zarathi ground positions east of the square. The Zarathi fleet had just bombed its own soldiers. Vorath roared, not in fear, not yet, but in fury, and the sound shook the air like something geological, and he swung his glaive in a wide arc that forced Lena backward as the world burned around them. "Tricks," he snarled, "tricks and machines and cowardice. Face me, human." Lena faced him. She drew no weapon because the weapon she needed was already in her hand. Monofilament wire, invisible and patient, threaded between her fingers like a spider's web made of starlight and murder. Vorath lunged, and he was fast, impossibly fast for something so large, and the glaive came down in a green arc that would have split Lena from shoulder to hip if she had been standing in the same place she had been standing a half-second earlier. But she was not. She moved the way Fenris had taught her to move a decade ago, the way Aegis operatives were trained to move against enemies 3 times their size, not with strength, but with geometry, not with power, but with precision, reading the angles of his body and the momentum of his strikes, and flowing around them like water around stone. He struck again and again, and each time she was somewhere else, somewhere impossible, and each dodge brought her a fraction closer to him, and each time she passed within reach, her hands moved in tiny, precise motions that looked like nothing at all. Vorath caught her on the fourth strike. The flat of the glaive hit her side, and sent her tumbling across the square, and she hit the ground hard, and something in her ribs broke, with a sound she felt more than heard. She stood up. He hit her again, a backhand that would have crushed the skull of a Zarathi warrior, and she went down, and her vision went white, and there was blood in her mouth, and she could feel the edges of consciousness fraying like old rope. She stood up. Vorath stared at her, and there was something new in his eyes now, something that was not contempt and not anger, but the beginning of an understanding that had come too late. "What are you?" he said, and for the first time his voice was not a command, but a question. Lena spat blood and looked at him with those dark, steady eyes, Mira's eyes, and she said the only thing that mattered. "I am her mother." Vorath raised the glaive for the killing blow, and Lena did not move, did not dodge, did not step aside, because she did not need to. The monofilament wire had been threading through the joints of his armor since the first dodge, fed through the gaps between plates with each tiny motion of her hands, looped around the seals at his shoulders and knees and throat in a pattern so precise it could have been drawn by a machine. She pulled. The wire went taut, and then it went through, and Vorath came apart the way a statue comes apart when you remove the bolts, not all at once, but in pieces, in sections, in a cascade of separation that turned the most feared general in the Zarathi Dominion into a monument to the terrible mistake of underestimating a mother's grief. He fell in the dirt of the same square where Mira had fallen, and the green light of his glaive flickered and died, and the silence that followed was so deep and so complete that it seemed to have weight. Around the square the surviving iron-teeth soldiers stared at the body of their general, and then they stared at the small human woman standing over him with blood running down her face and wire still singing between her fingers, and one by one they lowered their weapons, not because they were ordered to, because they understood. The Zarathi fleet retreated before dawn, leaderless and broken, and carrying with them a story that would spread through the Dominion like fire through dry grass. The story of a world they should not have touched, and a woman they should not have woken. 48 hours later, the first human ships arrived in orbit. Not a rescue fleet, but a battle group from Aegis Corps. And they did not come because of a distress signal. They came because of the evergreen signal. Fenris had been broadcasting from the moment the massacre began. Every death, every atrocity, every child laid in the dirt of that terrible square, every frame of footage captured by stolen helmet cameras and hacked surveillance systems sent on every frequency to every corner of the galaxy, in a continuous unbroken stream that could not be jammed, and could not be silenced, and could not be ignored. Every species in the Galactic Compact saw what the Zarathi had done to Evergreen 7, and every species saw what one human mother had done in response. The broadcast became the most watched transmission in galactic history, and it was given a name that would be remembered long after the people who named it were dust. They called it the Evergreen Signal, and it changed everything. Within one standard month, a coalition of 30 species filed a joint declaration demanding the complete disarmament of the Zarathi Dominion, and the Zarathi, whose empire had been built on the assumption that the galaxy was too afraid and too divided to stop them, discovered that the galaxy was neither of those things when it was angry enough. The Dominion fractured, its subject worlds rising in rebellion, military collapsing under the weight of defections and tribunals, and the simple, terrible realization that they had lost not a battle, but the story. And in galactic politics the story was everything. Lena did not attend the tribunals. She did not give interviews, or speeches, or testimony. She buried Mira on a hill overlooking the colony, in a spot where the morning sun hit first, and the wind carried the smell of grass and growing things, and she planted sunflowers around the grave. Every seed pressed into the earth by hand, every row straight and careful and perfect, because this was the last thing she could do for her daughter, and she was going to do it right. The sunflowers grew tall and golden, and they nodded in the breeze, like they were keeping a gentle conversation with someone just below the soil. The galaxy moved on the way galaxies do, with summits and treaties and new alliances, and the slow grinding machinery of civilizations, learning to be slightly less terrible to each other. And in the records and the histories and the war colleges of 100 worlds, the story of Evergreen 7 was studied and debated and argued over. But everyone agreed on one thing. At a galactic summit 3 years later, a Zarathi ambassador was asked by a journalist why the Dominion had agreed to total disarmament, a thing that no one in the history of the Zarathi species had ever done. The ambassador was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke. "Because we killed a human cub," he said. "And her mother woke up, and we learned too late that humans do not fight like soldiers. They fight like parents, and there is nothing in this universe more dangerous than that." The journalist asked if he had anything else to add. "Yes," said the ambassador, and his voice was heavy with something that might have been shame, or might have been awe, or might have been both. "Do not touch their children. On a green hill, under an amber sun, the sunflowers grew tall and swayed softly in the wind, and somewhere beneath them, a little girl slept, guarded now and forever by the most terrifying thing the galaxy had ever known."